Throughout history, humans have always found ways to kill each other. Some are brutal, and some we trick ourselves into believing are humane. Execution is no different and has been a long-standing practice in many civilizations throughout history. So today, we're going to be delving deep into the execution method Iceberg, covering some of the most brutal and sinister ways people have been executed. As traditional with Iceberg charts, we'll be starting with the more well-known ones, before making our way down to some of the more gruesome and blood-curdling methods that have been lost to the sands of time. So sit back, relax, and prepare as we explore into the execution method Iceberg. The surface level. The lethal injection. The most common form of capital punishment in the United States. The lethal injection was first proposed by Oklahoma State medical examiner Dr. J. Champman in 1977. The method was conceived as an alternative to traditional execution methods, which were beginning to be considered inhumane. Traditionally, a 3-drug protocol is used in the lethal injection, an anesthetic to induce unconsciousness and prevent the condemned person from feeling pain during the execution. A paralytic agent used to induce paralysis and halt muscular functions. This is to prevent visible movements or reactions that might occur during the execution. And finally, a cardiac arrest inducer, the final blow that stops the heart. Oklahoma was the first state to adopt the execution method. However, it was Texas that administered the first lethal injection. On December 7th, 1982, Charles Brooks Jr. was put to death for the murder of an auto mechanic, David Gregory. Charles was strapped to a bed and injected with the 3-drug protocol. At the time, the media focus was less on the Brooks trial, instead focusing on the new and exciting execution method that they were about to be shown. As such, at the death of Charles Brooks Jr., the lethal injection was introduced to the world. In 2023, 24 people were executed with the lethal injection, making it the most relevant and widely known entrant in our list. Hanging. While we've all seen the James Franco meme, for most people who stepped up to the gallows, their date with a rope was their last time. Hanging has been one of the most common methods of execution worldwide and has been employed in various cultures and periods. There are 3 methods of judicial hanging. A short drop, where the condemned prisoner stands on something small, a chair or ladder, for example. When a noose is placed around their neck, the support is then pushed away. The prisoner would then be suspended by their neck. The noose would tighten, strangling the victim till their death, which could take 10 to 20 minutes. More commonly used, however, are the standard and long drop methods. These were seen as more humane alternatives to the short drop, as the condemned are killed much quicker. In these forms, the noose is positioned around the prisoner's neck so that the knot of the rope is placed behind the left ear, allowing force to be applied to the back of the skull. The prisoner is then dropped through a trapdoor in the gallows. The drop causes the rope to tighten quickly, severing the prisoner's spinal cord. This sudden and severe damage causes a rapid loss of consciousness and ultimately death. This was seen as the more humane route of execution, as even in the old days, seeing someone squirm around for 20 minutes till they died wasn't considered classy. In a well-performed execution, death occurs just seconds after the prisoners are dropped from the gallows. However, just like the rest of us, executioners can have a bad day at the office. In 1803, German prisoner Joseph Samuel was to be executed in the British colony of New South Wales, Australia, for crimes he had committed with a gangmate. During the execution, which was watched by a large crowd, Samuel was placed on a cart in a short drop execution attempt. When the cart was driven away, Joseph Samuel dropped. However, instead of dying of strangulation, as his fellow prisoner did, Samuel's noose broke, causing him to fall to the ground and sprain his ankle. The executioner, embarrassed, hastily put together another noose and attempted to hang Mr. Samuel again. And once more, Joseph Samuel fell. This time, the noose slipped off his neck, and he landed on the ground safely. At this point, the crowd grew unruly, calling for Samuel to be freed. But once again, another noose was made, and Joseph Samuel was hung. That is, until the rope snapped, and he fell to the ground safely. At the third failed execution attempt, the crowd grew feral, pleading with the guards to let Joseph Samuel free. The governor was called onto the scene, and after an investigation that the rope had not been tampered with, he agreed with the crowd that it was a sign from God that Joseph Samuel should live. Thus, his sentence was downgraded from the death penalty to a life sentence. I guess we all have one of those days. Level 2, the electric chair. Our next entrant will give you a hell of a buzz. Once America's most popular form of execution, the electric chair has fallen out of popularity for lethal injection. The electric chair was introduced as a method of execution in the late 19th century as an alternative to hanging. It was developed in response to concerns about the perceived cruelty and inhumanity of other execution methods. I'm seeing a common trend here. The first electric chair was designed by dentist and inventor Dr. Alfred P. Southwick, who was inspired by witnessing an accidental death by electrocution. The electric chair's design is simple in theory. 2 electric currents are passed through the body to induce a fatal shock. The first, which is between 2,000 to 2,500 volts, is used to induce unconsciousness, ventricular fibrillation, and eventually cardiac arrest. The second current is less powerful at around 500 to 1,500 volts and is used to cause lethal damage to vital organs. Honestly, the first one sounds like it gets the job done. To prepare for the execution, prisoners are shaved of the hair on their head and body to allow for better contact with the electrodes. The prisoner is then taken to an execution chamber where they are seated in a chair that looks straight out of a saw film. Their legs and arms are strapped to the chair to keep movement minimal during the execution. Electrodes are then attached to the prisoner's body using a conductive gel. Typically, electrodes are placed on the scalp and the legs. The electrodes on the head facilitate the passage of electric current through the brain, while the leg electrodes ensure the current flows through the body. And from that, the prisoner is dead. Death is typically intended to occur within a matter of seconds to a few minutes. However, due to the many variants that can occur during the execution, such as the prisoner's weight and height, things don't always go as smoothly. Such was the case of William Kemmler in 1890. Kemmler was the first person to be executed using the electric chair. The execution was intended to demonstrate the new method's efficiency and humaneness. However, it quickly turned into a gruesome and prolonged ordeal. The initial application of electric current didn't result in immediate death, and Kemmler reportedly struggled and convulsed for several minutes before a second application of electricity was administered. Not a good start to life for the electric chair. More recently, in 1990, Jesse Tafero was executed by the electric chair in one of the most famous botched executions of all time was said to have inspired Stephen King's The Green Mile. During the execution, a synthetic sponge was placed on Teferos's head instead of the sea sponge that was normally used. This human error caused the chair to malfunction, and flames erupted from Tefero's head. 3 jolts of electricity were needed before Tefero was pronounced dead. Crucifixion. Arguably our most brutal execution method so far, crucifixion is an ancient method of execution in which a person is affixed to a cross or similar structure and left to die. Often, their feet and arms are bound or nailed to the structure holding them, and the condemned are in a public field for days until death. Crucifixion is intentionally designed to cause a slow and agonizing death. The person's weight is typically supported by nails through the wrists, forearms, feet, or ankles. As the body sags, breathing becomes difficult, leading to a form of asphyxiation. The victim must push up on the feet or pull up on the arms to take a breath, which for the punished becomes extremely painful. Over time, the combination of physical exhaustion, dehydration, blood loss, and respiratory issues leads the person to fall into shock and eventually death. Of course, the most famous practitioners of crucifixion are the ancient Romans, considering they did it to a man named Jesus H. Christ. But many ancient civilizations also used the method, as the Persians, Carthaginians, and ancient Greeks were also known to use crucifixion. The brutality and public nature of crucifixion were intended not only as a means of execution, but also as a deterrent. Onlookers would watch as the condemned was stripped naked and strung to a cross. This public display of brutality would embed fear in the common citizen, keeping those in authority in charge. Firing squad. The firing squad is a method of execution typically carried out by soldiers or law enforcement. Those who are to be executed are blindfolded and tied to a pole. Usually, a small target, such as a heart-shaped piece of cloth, is placed over the condemned's heart. Simultaneously, a line of men fire at the target with rifles to inflict a rapid death. Often, the firing squad was used for military discipline. Those considered deserters or traitors during the American Civil War were often executed by firing squad. In World War II, many nations used the execution method for those who committed offenses under military law. In 1945, Private Eddie Slovic was the last soldier in the United States to be executed by firing squad for desertion. 21,000 American soldiers were charged with desertion during World War II, but Eddie was the only one who was put to death. Before we continue, if you've been enjoying the video, why not subscribe? Since this is my first video, I have literally no subs, so any support would mean the world. I hope you've been enjoying the video so far, my lovelies. Now let's continue this deep dive. Third level, gas chamber. The gas chamber is a method of execution that involves administering lethal gas into an airtight chamber, where the condemned is often restrained in a chair. Most notably, the gas chamber was used as the main form of mass execution of Jews by the Nazis during World War II. During this time, millions of Jews were kept in concentration camps and crammed into chambers for execution. In Auschwitz, up to 800 people could fit into one chamber at any given time. Hydrogen cyanide was then leaked into the chambers. In 1943 to 1944, at the height of deportations from German-occupied land, an average of 6,000 Jews were gassed each day at Auschwitz alone. In the United States, several states adopted gas chambers as part of their execution methods during the 20th century. The last convict executed by the gas chamber in the United States that I could find was Walter Legrand. Guillotine. I feel like we've all seen a guillotine in movies. The structure has become synonymous with revolution. The guillotine became infamous during the French Revolution as a symbol of the Reign of Terror, but its use extended beyond that period. The guillotine was invented by Dr. Joseph-Ignace Guillotin, a French physician, in the late 18th century. Guillotin proposed the use of a machine that would make executions more humane and egalitarian. I'm not kidding. He thought it was more egalitarian. The new murder toy was adopted as the official execution method by the French government in 1792. It gained notoriety during the French Revolution of 1789 to 1799 and became a symbol of the radical revolutionary government's use of mass executions, particularly during the Reign of Terror, a time of intense political violence and mass executions led by Maximilien Robespierre. The guillotine was designed to be a quick and efficient means of execution. A heavy blade, usually weighing around 40 kilograms, was raised high and then released, swiftly descending through a guided track to sever the person's head from their body. The rapid severing of the head caused immediate loss of blood flow to the brain, resulting in unconsciousness and death within seconds. Many historians estimate that between 16,000 and 40,000 people were executed in France during the Reign of Terror, the majority with the guillotine. The last guillotine execution in France took place on September 10th, 1977, and was famously watched by Sir Christopher Lee, or Count Dooku to some. In 1984, France abolished capital punishment for all crimes, and with it, the guillotine was pushed off the bloody streets of France and into museums all around the world. Burned at the stake. Being burned at the stake has a long and gruesome history. Usually, the condemned is chained to a wooden stake, and straw or other materials are placed around their feet. Then, it is set ablaze. The chained person first begins to suffocate as the smoke begins to rise and cover their face. The fire would then rise quickly, and the victim would be engulfed in flames. The chained person's internal organs would shrink due to the extreme heat felt. Their skin would tighten around their neck so hard that at times, individuals would die of strangulation. As the skin is stripped away, body fat becomes fuel for the fire to rage hotter. Extreme pain is felt at the beginning of the execution, as the flames burn through the nerves. However, as the skin becomes charred, the pain passes. Death usually came quickly, as the smoke would suffocate the condemned. However, for the unlucky few who survived the burning, and some did survive, death would come a few days later, as their lungs were filled with liquid. Burning at the stake has been used by many different cultures throughout history, however. The most famous is the burning of witches in Europe. 50,000 people were tried and executed for witchcraft, many of whom were burned at the stake in public. Before we proceed, I would just like to give another warning. From here on out, the execution methods we discuss are lesser known, but a whole new level of gruesome. These entrants contain content that may be disturbing or upsetting to some. Viewer discretion is advised. Level 4, Garrote. The garrote is an execution method that involves strangling a person to death using a device, typically a metal collar or a cord. An individual is usually strapped to a chair with a wire or cord placed around their neck. The wire would then be hooked up to a tightening device attached to the back of the chair. The process would cause a brutal death by strangulation. The tightening of the device around the neck compresses the airway and blood vessels, preventing the flow of oxygen and causing unconsciousness and eventual death. Its notoriety comes from the brutality at which it was used during Spanish colonization. In the Philippines and Cuba, the garrote was used as a punishment for native peoples who broke away from the Catholic Church. Any accounts of heresy, practice of different religious beliefs, or cultural expression were shut down by the Spanish, who used the garrote as a tool of political repression. Although the device has a long history, it was only recently retired as an execution method. The last civilians to be executed by the garrote were Pilar Prad's José María Jarabo in May 1959, but was still used as a sentence for military personnel in Franco's Spain. But when Franco died in 1975, he took the garrote with it, and the method was officially retired in Spain. Blown from a gun. To be blown from a gun is an execution style that's exactly what it sounds like. The victim is tied to the mouth of a gun or cannon, which is then shot, and the person is obliterated. Most often, a blank shot was used over a cannonball, but it was not unheard of for executioners to shoot live rounds. This particular method of execution was described as extremely brutal by those who witnessed it. It was said that heads would fly 50 feet in the air, arms shot forward, and the body would eviscerate. But the person's legs would simply fall below the muzzle. When researching this method, I was shocked to see how widely used it was, as I had only known it for its use by the British Empire during its occupation of India. But the method was also used by the Portuguese Empire across their colonies, and even in Afghanistan. But it's the British Empire who were famous for its use. They used the method extensively during the crushing of the Indian Rebellion in 1857. It's reported around 44 people were executed in this way after the rebellion. Soldiers would often report seeing birds of prey swooping down and catching pieces of flesh, while other soldiers were said to be put off by the pack of wild dogs that would linger, waiting to pick up any flesh that was left behind. Keel hauling. Keel hauling is a historical maritime punishment that involves dragging a person underwater along the ship's keel. The punishment was used as both a form of extreme torture and execution, often used as a naval punishment. Sailors were punished for offenses they committed when out at sea. The victim was tied by a rope and thrown overboard. Using a system of pulleys, the crew would drag the sailor underneath the keel of the boat, which was covered in barnacles and other sea growth. As the victims scraped alongside the bottom of the boat, their skin would be peeled from their body, and deep lacerations would cut through their flesh, all while salt water filled their lungs and wounds. It's reported multiple sailors had their heads smashed against the boards of the boat, causing head trauma if they were to survive. The victim would then surface on the opposite side of the boat in extreme agony or, mercifully, dead. The method was most popular as a form of discipline and deterrence for naval authorities, a showing of the power of their crew in the hopes of keeping the hardened men under their thumb. Level 5. Boiling to death. Being boiled to death was an execution used around the world in the Middle Ages, often used in parts of Asia and Europe. The victim was placed in a large cauldron filled with boiling water, which sat on top of an open fire. The victim would, of course, suffer immense pain. Boils and blisters would form, often causing the skin to peel away. The extreme heat would damage the internal organs, and the body would begin to shut down. The intense pain and psychological pain would cause the victim to enter shock. The victim would then fall into unconsciousness due to overwhelming pain. Death would soon follow afterward. In Europe, the punishment was used for crimes that were considered most heinous against the clergymen of the time. Alexander II, King of Scotland, was said to have executed up to 80 people through this means. In the Holy Roman Empire, coin forgers and swindlers were executed by being thrown into a boiling cauldron of oil. In the Dutch town of Deventer, a kettle that was used for boiling alive can still be seen from the streets. So that's a fun tourist attraction, I guess. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull, also known as the Sicilian Bull, was a hollow brass statue resembling a bull with a door on one side. This macabre device was used to execute individuals, and the cruelty of its design aimed to maximize suffering. It's said the structure was the size of an actual bull, and the acoustic apparatus of the structure converted the screams of the condemned into the sound of a bull. Reportedly, the Brazen Bull was a means of execution created in ancient Greece, designed for the tyrant of Acragas, Phalaris. The victim was forced inside the bull, and a fire was set alight on the underside. The bronze metal would then heat up to incredible temperatures. The heat of the metal would essentially cook the person inside. The burning metal would char their body, and the loss of oxygen would cause asphyxiation. All while their screams echoed out into the town. According to legend, when the bull was cooled and opened up, a completely charred body would greet those looking inside, and the bones of the victims shone like jewels and were made into bracelets. Eaten alive by animals. Okay, this one is exactly how it sounds. Being eaten alive is a horrific execution method that was used in a lot of ancient civilizations. The victim was either confined in a small enclosure or a wide area, with starved animals who would hunt the victim down. In ancient Rome, the punishment was known as damnatio ad bestias, and was used as a form of entertainment for the lower class of Rome. The condemned, usually a criminal, slave, or prisoner of war, was thrown into an amphitheater with hungry tigers, wolves, or, on rare occasions, lions. Historians often agree that two forms of punishment existed, one where the condemned were expected to fight to the death with the beast, and one where the victim was simply fed to hungry animals in a spectacle. The event was often a gruesome and brutal sight. Many times, death did not come fast to the victims. Their flesh was ripped off and eaten by the starved animals, all while the person lay there, seen breathing and alive. I mean, I'd rather just go to the movies. Level 6. Immurement. Immurement is an execution method involving confining a person within a small space, such as a wall, tomb, or other enclosed structure, leading to eventual death due to dehydration, starvation, or suffocation. This form of execution is characterized by entombing or walling a person in, preventing their escape and survival. Unlike being buried alive, where the condemned would usually die of asphyxiation, immurement was noted for its long, drawn-out, and agonizing death. A form of physical and psychological torture, as the victim would spend days alone, waiting for their eventual death. Oftentimes, the victim was immured behind a wall, in caskets, or in small rooms. The punishment has also been used as a form of early life imprisonment, with victims being given food and water. In 1906, a cobbler from Marrakesh, Morocco, was found guilty of the murder of 36 women. For his crimes, he was immured behind a wall alive. It's said his screams were heard for 2 consecutive days, before eventually falling silent on the 3rd. Within parts of Asia and southeastern Europe, immurement has been a sacrificial motif in tales. It was said that after the completion of a building, if a person was immured at the foundation of the building, the structure would be blessed to stand for a long time. Death flights. Death flights were a brutal and sinister form of state-sponsored terrorism and execution employed by military regimes in Argentina and Chile during the 1970s and early 1980s. Simply put, victims were flown high up in military aircraft and pushed or forced to jump out of these aircraft to their deaths. This tactic of terrorism was employed heavily by dictator Jorge Rafael Videla, who was installed as the head of Argentina's military junta after a 1976 CIA and American-backed right-wing coup. While it's difficult to measure how many people were killed by death flights due to the secret and covert nature of the operations, it's estimated around 13,000 to 30,000 people disappeared under his reign. Former Argentine naval officer Adolfo Silingo, who was charged with crimes against humanity in 2005, estimated that 150 to 200 death flights took place from 1977 to 1978 alone, killing anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 people. Many of those who were killed were perceived political dissidents, people affiliated with left-wing political organizations, human rights activists, labor leaders, professors, students, and their families were all seen as threats to the military regime, and therefore were targeted and killed by the government of the time. Blood eagle. The blood eagle is a form of execution described in Norse mythology and historical accounts, including the legendary sagas of the Vikings. And just a heads up, this description gets pretty gnarly. First, the victim would be laid face down, and their back would be prepared for the ritual. The executioner would then carve the shape of an eagle into the victim's back, cutting through the skin and muscle to expose the ribcage. The executioner would then proceed to break the ribs away from the spine and spread them outward, resembling the wings of an eagle. Salt would be sprinkled into the wounds to enhance the pain. The process was intended to be both torturous and fatal. The victim would eventually die from a combination of shock, blood loss, and organ damage. The most famous account of the blood eagle comes from the legendary saga of the semi-legendary figure Aella, a Northumbrian king. According to the saga, Aella was captured by the sons of the legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok. In retribution for the death of their father, they executed A. Ella using the blood eagle method. It's important to note that the historical accuracy of the blood eagle is a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the ritual might have been a literary device or a poetic exaggeration rather than a historical reality. Level 7. Scaphism. Scaphism was an alleged ancient Persian method of execution that involved trapping the victim in a container, such as two hollowed-out boats, with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. The victim was then fed and covered in honey and milk. The boats are then pushed out to a body of water. The exposed parts of the victim left uncovered begin to attract insects, especially flies. Over time, the mixture of milk and honey served as food for insects. The exposed parts of the victim became a breeding ground for flies, maggots, and other pests. The insects would eat away at the victim's skin, then burrow into their body and eat the honey inside their stomach, leading to infections and decomposition, all while the person was still alive. The person would suffer from extreme discomfort, pain, and eventually death. Scaphism is associated with ancient Persia and is often attributed to the Achaemenid Empire. The method is described in historical accounts. While many of the stories written by ancient historians will have some degree of exaggeration or mythologizing, the general concept is that the method is aimed at inflicting prolonged suffering on the victim before death. Suffocation in ash. This execution method was performed in ancient Persia and was a cruel and brutal death for the victim. The individual who was to be executed was immersed in ash completely until total asphyxiation. The accused would usually be plunged into a tower where wheels would be constantly turning to keep the ash whirling around the room. As the ash filled their lungs, they struggled, gasping for oxygen, which would only bring them more ash. Eventually, after an excruciating amount of time, the individual would suffocate to death. Sawing. This one is as brutal as it sounds. The execution method of sawing involves just cutting someone in half with a tree saw. I guess they ran out of ways to be creative. There were usually two methods of sawing, although both had the same result. On some occasions, a victim would be cut horizontally through the chest. However, more often, the victim would be restrained with their ankles tied to a wooden structure so that they hung upside down. Their wrists would then be tied up. The executioners would then begin the sawing vertically, cutting through the lower parts first before making their way to the lungs, heart, and skull. However, there are historical accounts of victims not being sawn all the way through. In some circumstances, the victims would only be cut halfway down to their stomach. They would then be left to die slowly, as no major arteries were cut. It could take days for the person to bleed out. A slow and agonizing death. Stories of Christian martyrs being executed this way are very common. Simon the Zealot is one of the most famous examples of this case. However, execution by sawing was a popular means of the death penalty all around the world, having been used in Burma, Vietnam, Hungary, and Egypt. The final level. And here we come to the final level of our iceberg. I hope you've enjoyed your journey into the depths. This level only has one entry, but it might be the most insane one we've talked about yet. Death by anti-aircraft gun. Researching this one entry, I was a bit confused. Was this an execution method employed in World War II? Was this a rumored method of execution from the wars in the Middle East? Well, actually, this method comes from possibly a stranger source. Death by an aircraft gun was, allegedly, a method of execution used by the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in 2017. The method of execution was said to be a part of a purge of 5 senior officials in the North Korean government, who Kim Jong-un believed had made false reports that were seen as a threat to his leadership. None of the news articles or reports I saw go into any detail about how the executions were carried out. However, I would imagine they were similar to the firing squad execution style, except this time it's a 10-ton cannon used to shoot down warplanes. And if you haven't seen what an anti-aircraft gun looks like, here you go. Yeah, I don't think there's anything left after that. And that's the end of the video. This was the first video I've done, so I want to thank you for watching all the way through. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing, as I have a lot more on the way. If you got this far, I'd love to know what you think is the most brutal execution style on this list. And drop a knife emoji alongside it so I know you made it to the end. I'd love to know how I can improve the videos too. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Thank you for watching. Have a great night, and I'll see you next time.